What is up, guys? Welcome back to some more super fun PPL ground school stuff. I was going to come back yesterday, but got a little carried away at the airport doing other stuff. Got to play around in a Lear 45 yesterday that was connected to a GPU so they could turn everything on. My friend was getting ready to fly somewhere in it, so I got to play in the cockpit for a little while, which was pretty cool. So didn't get to come back yesterday to talk about this stuff, but I'm back now, and we're going to go through essentially what I want to talk about is density altitude, but we're going to go through some of the flight planning stuff that we kind of used, or we're going to go through first to get to density altitude in the first place. One of the first things we're going to talk about is navigation terminology. So this is going to give you guys a concept of how you would do your planning and stuff for your flight anyway. So when you do private pilot and even commercial pilot, both of your check rides are going to start with some sort of navigational plan, right? So the instructor or the examiner is going to say, hey, plan a cross-country flight to X, Y, and Z. You can't use GPS when you do it. You have to use a combination of pilotage and dead reckoning, and you have to use a map. So when I get in the airplane, he's going to turn the GPS off. You're going to have to disconnect your iPad or whatever. Or, like for example, when I did my private pilot, I was literally using a physical paper map, that's pretty much the easiest way to make a flight plan in the first place. So one of the first things to understand is that, look at this image over here. We have true north, which is the geographical North Pole, right? So if we're looking at a map, a 2D representation of the Earth, we have lines of longitude, which are the vertical lines, and the lines of latitude. Those are all in relation to true north. So if we go over to our sectional chart here, these black lines with hashes, these are lines of longitude and latitude in relation to true north. And each one of these little hash marks is 1 nautical mile. And an easy rule of thumb, for example, if you've got a paper chart and you're doing your diversion on a check ride or something, is that 1 inch equals about, I think, 6 statute miles or nautical miles. So if you need to get the term rule of thumb, right? You can just put your thumb on the map and say, okay, that's about 6 miles, so I know how much fuel that you need to get to the diversion airport or something. And then the other thing, obviously, we have magnetic North Pole. So if you imagine lines of longitude and latitude extending from this one versus true north, we can actually see those in the sectional chart too, and I'll explain why they're important in a second. But these segmented magenta lines, they're called isogonic lines, and they show magnetic variation in relation to longitude, if that makes any sense. So again, we have two separate types of latitude and longitude, whether or not they're in relation to true north or magnetic north. So the first thing that we would do if we were making a flight plan, and of course all this has to be done on paper, you would fill out like a VFR flight log or something like that. You would start with your sectional chart, right? And you would literally draw a line, a physical line between point A, point B. I just did a quick one from my home airport to where I've been flying to go do check rides, which is up in Greenville. Obviously some TFRs, so might not be flying there today. And then you would measure, I'm not going to explain how to do this because you'd have to be physically present, right? We have like a tool that has basically a protractor. So you'd put that on your map in relation to these lines of longitude, and then it would give you what's called your true course. And a true course is the direction of flight is measured on a chart clockwise, right? So we know north is 0 degrees, east is 90 degrees, south is 180 degrees, and west is 270 degrees. So we're measuring true course in relation to true north. So using these lines of latitude and longitude. And that would give you your course over the ground in relation to true north. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, to make this easier for everybody, it says 062 degrees, but we'll say 060 just to make it easy. To figure out your true heading, right, that's the direction of the longitudinal axis of the plane when it's in relation to true north. So there's a difference between course and heading. Course is your direction of movement over the ground or in relation to the ground. And an easy way to remember this is your nose. Your nose is on your face, which is on your head, right? So where the nose of the airplane is pointing is your heading. So a true heading would be, we would get there by applying wind correction angle or something like that. So in order to keep us on this true course, we would have a heading that we would have to fly to compensate for wind direction to maintain true course, if that makes any sense. In fact, here's what I'll do. I'll get my trusty paint pad out here. So true course is where we start. And then it's going to be plus or minus your wind correction angle. So in our case, for example here, if we're flying 060, let's say we had a wind from the north, so 350 at 6 knots or something. The wind's going to push us laterally to the south, meaning we're going to divert to the right because of the wind. So we would have to have a wind correction angle of a few degrees to the north or to the left of course to maintain our true course, if that makes any sense. So this is basically where we're starting with our nav log. So true course plus your wind correction angle, and that's going to give you your true heading. So the heading we need to fly basically to make sure that we maintain our true course. And now here's where the variation comes in. So again, we have a true course, which is we do in relation to true north, but we navigate an airplane by using magnetic direction finders or a compass, right? So when you get in an airplane, what you're doing, once you get the airplane started up and the vacuum pump is running, right, is providing suction for your directional gyro. So you're going to line up your directional gyro with your magnetic compass because it's more stable. The magnetic compass is subject to acceleration and deceleration errors as well as turning errors. So rather than relying on that for navigation in flight, we're going to use the directional gyro, which is stabilized by a gyroscope, obviously. So we line that up with the magnetic compass. So all of our navigation is done in reference to magnetic directions. And the way that we do that is by finding the lines, the isogonic lines on the sectional chart. So we're only crossing one on our flight today. So see it says 6 degrees west. I'm not sure if you guys can see that on Twitch, but you'll take my word for it. So then looking at our nav log, so we have our true, where do we go? There she is. True heading plus or minus the variation. And variation means the angular difference between true north and magnetic north. So again, if we go back and look at, there's an angular difference here. So obviously the black lines that we're seeing on our sectional chart, those are true north. That's giving us our longitude, right? But we need to figure out the angular difference here since we're using a magnetic compass for navigation. And the easy way to remember variation is east is least. This is hard writing with a mouse. East is least, meaning if we have east variation on our chart, we're going to subtract the difference. And west is best. That's positive. So if we have, like on our chart, for example, it's 6 degrees west, it's positive, so we're going to add that variation. So we got 60 degrees true course. Let's say our wind correction angle was minus, since we had to turn to the left, it's going to be a minus, so we'll say minus 5 degrees. So that gives us our true heading, which is going to be 55 degrees. But again, since we have to do this in relation to a magnetic compass, and we have, let's just double check that our variation is 6 degrees west. So 55 plus 6, and that gives us 61 degrees. And that is going to be your magnetic heading. Oops. So one more time. It starts with true course plus or minus your wind correction angle. That gives you a true heading. Then we have to add or subtract the magnetic variation, which gives us a magnetic heading. So our magnetic heading now is 61 degrees. And there's one term, and additionally, so we have variation. That's the angular difference between true north and magnetic north. And there's one more magnetic term that we have to know, which is deviation. So the plane itself, because of the metals that are involved, like the shape of the metals, the avionics that are installed in the airplane, those influence our magnetic compass. So it causes what's called deviation. So you can imagine deviation as being like the individual magnetic field of the airplane. So I'm sure that you guys, flight simmers, particularly for civil aviation, and you can see them in combat planes too. You've seen these cards in the cockpit. They're placarded somewhere. It's basically a steer card, and it's individually tailored for a specific airplane. Each one has their own somewhere in the airplane, has to be visible. Usually they're below the compass or somewhere near the compass. So if we look at this one, for example, if we, let's say, for example, our, going back here, our magnetic heading was 350 or 360, so we got to go north. there's no deviation inside the airplane. So if we want to go 360, we don't need to steer additionally. But ours, we're going 060 basically. And look at the difference here. So if we want to go 060, we actually have to steer -4, right? Because of the deviation, the magnetic deviation inside the aircraft. So the last thing that you would do to figure out a compass heading would be, so we know our magnetic heading was 061, and then it's going to be plus or minus your deviation, which for us was, I believe, -4. Is that right? 060, yeah, -4. 61 minus 4 equals 57 degrees. Right, and this is your compass heading. This is the final one that we need to use for our flight. Compass heading. I'm not going to go into wind correction angle, which is one of the first things, but you'd have to get your winds aloft, for example, and that would be dependent on the density altitude for you to find your true airspeed, right? So you'd put all that into your E6B to get a wind correction angle. So I'm not going to go into that. It's really getting into the weeds. But again, just to review the basic premise here for flight planning, we're starting with the true course, which is the line drawn over the ground in relation to true north, so those lines of latitude and longitude on the sectional chart. Then we're adding or subtracting our wind correction angle. For the sake of argument, it was -5 degrees for a north wind. And that's giving you your true heading. And then to find the magnetic heading, we need to add or subtract the variation, which is the angular difference between true north and... What's up, Serious John? Do I need help? Well, yeah, kind of. You can tell me if this makes sense to you. If you're a pilot, you can tell me if I make a mistake. Plus or minus variation, which is variation being the angular difference between true north and magnetic north, which again we can find by looking at the lines, the isogonic lines, these segmented magenta lines. West is best, so add our difference there. So 6 degrees plus 6 degrees for us. If it was east, east is least, we would subtract. So going back to our plan, 6 degrees here is going to give you your magnetic heading, which was 61 degrees. And then, of course, we've got the deviation, which is changes in the magnetic field caused by the airplane. And again, we would figure out that by looking at our compass card placarded for the individual airplane, which for us was this. So 060, or yeah, 060, we're going to steer -4, 56 degrees. And all of those changes in combination is going to give you your compass heading. So once we get in the airplane, once we take off, to maintain our true course, right, to maintain that imaginary magenta line that we've drawn on our sectional chart, we're going to be using the compass heading, which is going to be specific for an individual airplane. Got it? Everybody got it? We're all good? Any questions? So we covered true course, true heading, magnetic course, magnetic heading, compass heading, deviation and variation. Correct. Let's erase all this crap. Now we're going to start getting into the fun stuff. So the other thing I mentioned, for example, if we want to find our wind correction angle, one of the ways that we'd have to do that is by determining what our true airspeed is going to do. And the way that we're going to do that is by finding density altitude, which is a term that I'm sure that, yes, it is. So I'm starting with the terminology, I guess, and kind of outlining how we do this. But the biggest thing is density altitude, which when I was doing private pilot, it was something that's very easy to calculate, and it's easy to understand how we apply that to flight planning. But what it means practically, or to understand what it means in a way that you can express it or to explain it to someone else, is really conceptually hard. Like, for example, the first time that I asked, sometimes when you tune into your ATIS or your AWOS or ASOS or something, you're going to hear density altitude. I'm like, okay, what is that? And I'm a new pilot. I don't know what it is. My instructor, of course, he's like, well, that's pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Like, do you understand? Or he said basically something along the lines of it's where the airplane feels like it's at. And does that make sense? No, not really. You know what I mean? It's really hard to talk about. But before we get to density altitude, some standard or some atmospheric terminology that we need to know. I'm sure that most of you guys, particularly if you're involved with civil aviation flight sims, you know what standard pressure is. All the guys that are going up into the flight levels doing tube flights and stuff like that. Once you get to flight level 180, I have an E6B. It's not on me. I'm probably not going to... I have a calculator, so I'm going to show you how to do density altitude manually. But normally what I would do is use an E6B. That's the easiest thing to do. But I'm kind of paring this down, is boiling it down to simple terms as much as I can. Because what I want to do, and the reason that I'm doing this, is I'm practicing for my CFI certificate, and what I want to make sure that I'm capable of doing is understanding written test for what? CFI? All I'm trying to do is make sure that I can explain something. Oh, perfect. You're exactly who I want to talk to. Because this is mostly associated with the PPL understanding of density, altitude, and stuff like that. So if you can understand what I'm saying, that is absolutely perfect. So you're exactly my target audience. So you just passed your written tests, which is good. You made at least a 70. What score did you get? If you don't mind if I ask. And while we're waiting for that, so standard pressure again, you guys, once you get up into the flight levels, you're switching the altimeter. On your altimeter, there's a window that allows us to adjust the pressure. That's called a Kollsman window, Kollsman. So we can calibrate the pressure there. But standard pressure, as you know, is 29.92 inches of mercury, right? Then that's for U.S. flying. I know obviously they use millibars in commie land, but for our purposes, for the FAA written test and for oral exams, it's going to be in inches of mercury for us. Standard pressure 2992 inches of mercury, and that's at sea level, right? So all of this is at sea level. Standard pressure. Then we've got standard temperature. PPL written test guy. Serious John, do you know what standard temperature is? Let's see. You get to take another test now. 2992 inches of mercury and standard pressure. Yeah, there he is. 15 degrees Celsius, or you say 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And these things, so this is at sea level, 2992 inches of mercury, 15 degrees Celsius, and that's what's called an international standard atmosphere. Got it? Everybody got it? That's easy. And again, most of you should be familiar with this if you're into flight simming and stuff, particularly if you're into general aviation or civil aviation, because these things are, when you get your ATIS, that's the first thing that we're doing. We're checking for temperature and pressure. Let's see. So then we've got different kinds of altitude, which is eventually going to lead us where we need to be. The first one is indicated altitude. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Indicated altitude, or that's your altitude read directly from the altimeter after it's set to the current pressure setting, right? So you get in your airplane, you get your ATIS, it says, okay, it's altimeter is 3014. You adjust the Kollsman window. That changes the altitude on the altimeter. Obviously, that's giving you your indicated altitude. True altitude. True altitude is the true vertical distance of the aircraft above mean sea level, or MSL, right? So this is basically your MSL altitude. And this is what's used on our sectional charts, stuff like that. So for each of these grid squares, like if we look here, we see 5 with a smaller 4. This is telling us that the highest terrain feature, man-made or otherwise, in this sector is 5,400 feet MSL, or basically our true altitude. So it's easy to use this as a quick reference for flight planning, because you can say, hey, we want at least a minimum separation vertically of 1,000 feet, which means that we want to be at least 6,500 for this sector, 6,400 for this. Right, exactly. If you don't have your local altimeter setting, what you can do is check the charts, and you can set your altimeter so it's reading field elevation, which generally gets you in the ballpark. The difference between, or being that, there are calibration errors of the altimeter, so there's going to be some variation. And for IFR flying, basically once you set the local pressure, what you're looking for is to be within 75 feet of field elevation. So you're allowed basically, 180 feet difference, 75 on either side of 0. So we got our true altitude, that one. Next one is absolute altitude, which is easy to remember. Absolute altitude is your AGL. And it's easy to remember for me because absolute starts with an A, AGL, obviously AGL. And that's your vertical distance of the aircraft above the surface of the Earth. And then, of course, now we're getting into the fun stuff, getting into the weeds that everybody loves, is pressure altitude. And pressure altitude, I guess the private pilot definition And well, I'm not going to say easy. Pressure altitude is altitude adjusted for non-standard pressure. Another way to describe that is basically a height above a standard datum. And our standard datum, meaning that baseline where we're starting, is our international standard atmosphere. So 2 And there's two ways that we can find it, both of which are incredibly easy. The first one being if we're in an aircraft, right? If we want to find the pressure altitude, and as an addendum here, pressure altitude is only important for figuring out density altitude. The only reason that we're going to ever look or talk about pressure altitude is simply to help us find density altitude. Because density altitude is the most important thing as pilots for flight planning and performance and all of those things, which I'll explain a little bit more later. So the two ways that we can find pressure altitude, number one, once we get in the cockpit of the airplane, we can set the Kollsman window on our altimeter to 2 That's the standard datum, right? That's our international standard atmosphere. And that's, of course, going to change our altimeter, and that's going to give us the pressure altitude. And the other way, which is also equally easy if you have a calculator, which I'm going to have to bust out because I am not a math person. Let's say, like today, for example, I was at the airport earlier, the pressure was 3014, right? So what we're going to do, we need to find the difference between 2992. So we're going to subtract 3014. 2992 minus 3014 equals minus 0.22, right? We're going to move the decimal place. So multiply that by 1,000, and that gives us minus 220. So basically this is telling us that what we would do to find our pressure altitude is subtract 220 feet. So the altitude at our airport is 1,062 feet. So 1,062 minus 220 means the pressure altitude at our airport is 842 feet. Does that make pretty good sense? It's pretty easy to understand. And again, the only reason that we're figuring this out is to help us find density altitude. So again, we're going to start with 2992, and we're going to subtract the difference. So it could be lower, right? So let's say the pressure was lower than standard. It was 2892. That's going to give us a positive number, so we're going to add that instead of subtracting. Super easy. Everybody got it? Let me start on it. Remember 842. 842 is our pressure altitude. 842, pressure altitude. And then the last type of altitude, and this is the most important altitude if you are a pilot, it's a thing that we're all trying to figure out, is density altitude, which is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Let that sink in for a second. It doesn't really sound like it means anything just yet, but let's talk about atmosphere for a second. So we remember our standard atmosphere, right? Let's say here is a parcel of air, or a cross-section of our atmosphere. And at standard pressure, it's 2992 inches of mercury and 15 degrees Celsius, right? So at standard pressure, the closer that we are to the surface of the Earth, the more gravity we're going to experience. I mean, we can't feel much of a difference at altitudes, but obviously because air is a low viscous fluid, right, it's going to be much more susceptible to changes in gravity. So at the surface, the air particles are tightly compact. I apologize for my shitty drawings. It's supposed to be dots. You guys understand what I'm saying, right? The further that we go, the higher that we go, the more these air molecules are going to space out. Does that make pretty good sense to everybody? And the reason that temperature, that we're going to correct our pressure altitude for quote-unquote non-standard temperature, is because temperature is the biggest thing that influences density altitude. So let's look at another parcel of air. So this is at 15 degrees Celsius. Let's say this one, same pressure, but 30 degrees Celsius. In physics, right, heat is basically energy. So what is that energy going to do? How does that energy impart itself to air molecules kinetically? So the more heat that we have, the more energy we're putting into the air particles, which is going to cause them to basically vibrate, right? They kind of move around kinetically. And what happens is they basically bounce off of each other, which makes the air at a higher temperature less dense. Does that make any sense? So again, you're going to have the same decrease in density the higher that we go, but because we have an increase in temperature, particularly at the surface, that's going to change the density of the air. And it works the same way then if we're doing colder. Let's say again, one more parcel of air going down. So here's standard 15 degrees. Here's 30 degrees, which is 90 something degrees, so it's really hot. The air molecules are now further apart because of how much kinetic energy or energy we're putting in there with heat. On a cold day, let's say it's 0 degrees, we're taking energy out of that system. Does that make sense? So there's going to be less kinetic energy. Exactly. Well, in hot air is less dense, yes. And cold air is more dense because we're taking the kinetic energy out, which is allowing those air molecules to basically settle. So it's going to be more dense. Now what I need to do is get the airbrush. That would probably help. So our cold air is going to be more dense than our standard day. Again, I apologize for my drawing. I'm probably not helping, but I hope that makes some good sense. Exactly, more dense when you're cold. And again, in all cases, you're going to experience the same decrease in density as we go up because of gravity. And the reason that this is important is because we determine all of the aircraft performance by the density of air. They do. And here's another way to visualize how this works. There's a couple of different things. You're a private pilot. You just took your instrument or your knowledge test for private pilot, right? And you don't really go into the weeds too much about this, but you have a pitot-static system. So basically, we'll use like a Cessna 172 as an example. So here's our pitot tube. I'm sure you guys have all seen this. At the front, we have what's called a ram air hole or ram air intake. And at the back, you've got a drain tube, right? And then this is, of course, connected to your altimeter, which is also connected to a static port somewhere on the airplane. The static port is usually flush. On the Cessna, it's flush with the airplane along the nose. So it measures static air pressure, right? And what's happening with our pitot tube is that we're allowing air molecules into the pitot tube through ram air pressure, and which is exactly what it sounds like. We're ramming the air into the pitot tube by moving the airplane forward. And the way that this system works is that the higher that we go, right, that the pressure is changing, it's decreasing, and the difference between static pressure and ram air is changing, which then allows a wafer inside the system to expand with less or more air going into it. And the more that it expands with higher airspeed, it's going to increase what's reading on our airspeed. Altimeter is basically the same way, but only using static pressure. I hope that makes any sense. But the way that we get airspeed, let's say, for example, at our rotate speed is roughly 60 knots. In order for the airspeed indicator to read 60 knots, we need, let's say, for example, 10 air molecules inside the ram air tube, the static port. So the higher that we go, the less air molecules there are, right? Actually, pitot only uses airspeed and altitude. Yes, that's right. I'm talking about airspeed now, particularly because it's performance related. In order to get 60 knots, we have to have 10 air molecules inside the ram air. And the higher that we go, the less dense the air is. So we're going to actually have to travel faster through the air to get those same 10 molecules into the ram air tube. And it works the same way with creating lift. So if we've got an airfoil like we were talking about last time, in order to generate enough lift to get airborne, it needs a certain number of air molecules moving over the surface. So obviously, if we're in a hot day where the density at the surface is less than it is on a cold day, the plane's going to perform worse, right? So you're still going to have to get to 60 miles an hour, but it's going to take you longer to get there because we're having to move a smaller or less dense parcel or volume of air over the surface of the wing to get us there. Does that make any sense? This is why density altitude is important, right? So having a high density altitude, meaning the plane believes that it's at a higher altitude than normal where there's less dense air, it's going to decrease performance. So on hot days, performance is decreased. On cold days, because like we can see here, the air density is much higher, the plane performs a lot better. That's why density altitude is important. And the rough estimate for density altitude is, we figure out our density altitude equals pressure altitude plus 120 times the difference in outside air temperature, OAT, and international standard atmosphere. And I'll show you exactly how this works in terms of imbuing energy into a system by using this formula, right? So we got our density altitude from 4 was 842. So let's start with a cold day first. So 842 plus 120 times 0 minus 15. All right, so 0 minus 15 is negative 15, obviously. Gotta get my calculator here because I'm not a smart math boy. Clear. 0 minus 15 times 120 means give us minus 1800. And our pressure altitude from before was 842. So 842 plus negative 1800, or you could just subtract that, equals minus 958. So our density altitude here is minus 958, which means that the plane is going to perform as if it's almost 1,000 feet below sea level. So we're increasing the performance of the airplane because the air is more dense. Got it? Got it? Everybody got it? Now let's look at the same thing but with a higher temperature. So now we're imparting a lot more energy into the system. So instead of 0, we'll say 30. So 30 minus 15 is going to be positive 15. Go back to my trusty calculator. 15 times 120 is 1800, obviously, so we'll make that positive. 1800 plus 842. Now we've got 2,642 feet. So now our density altitude at the surface is almost 3,000 feet. So we're talking about a 400-foot performance, almost, what is that, 3,000-foot difference in performance. So now the plane at the surface is going to perform as if we're actually flying 2,642 feet in the air. And that's why density altitude is the most important thing for calculating performance, because obviously a higher density altitude is going to increase our takeoff roll, it's going to increase the landing roll, it's going to decrease our climb performance, right? All of these things. I hope that makes sense, guys. I think it's difficult to understand in this way, but it's easy to apply to calculate, right? Obviously, for flight planning reasons, we start with density altitude. That's the most important thing for us to find. So it's easy to calculate a number, but what it means conceptually is a little bit different. What else do I talk about today? I think that's basically it that I wanted to talk about. Does that make any sense to you guys? Or if you guys have any questions, let me know. Now is the time. I can't really go into flight planning because a lot of this stuff I think has to be physically present with someone to show them how to do, using your E6B and all that kind of stuff. Man, I think that about covers it today. I don't think I'm going to do many more of these. I think I'll be back to playing DCS and flight simulators in the next couple of days. But if you're watching on YouTube, leave me a comment. Let me know if that makes sense. And if you want to see anything in particular, for example, Cirrus John, you're working on your PPL right now. Airspace system, navigation systems, any of that kind of stuff that you want me to talk about, I would be happy to do it. And just to reiterate, yeah, like you said, the static port is only for altitude. Airspeed, you're only going to get from your ram air versus your drain tube on the pitot system. And there's different kinds of pitot systems too. So, we did the a Cessna 172, but on the Pipers, they have what's called a pitot-static column. So we have a ram air hole on the front. The bottom, there's a drain hole, and the static port is on the back of the column. They're all connected into one little unit that's on the bottom of the wing. Good stuff, John. Good luck on your private test. Do you have any? Have you planned your actual check ride? I flew a Piper Warrior for a little bit of my instrument stuff, and the flight school ended up getting rid of it. But for instrument, you have to do a long cross country, and I did it on kind of a warm day. And I'm a tall guy. My instructor he's a little bit heavier, so with the two of us in the airplane, I think our climb performance was less than 200 feet a minute, which was not very good. ATC was like, "Go ahead and give me your best climb so I can get you on course." It's like, we're giving it all we got, boss. The Warrior, it was a good plane. It has this really long. I mean, particularly compared to the Cherokees, like the planform is so much wider. There's so much more lift, but it's also a lot more drag. They're a lot heavier with basically the same engine. I enjoyed flying it, but they weren't the most performing airplanes in the world. Solo, where do you fly out of? Let's take a look at that airspace. KMAC, where's KMAC? Oh, you're Macon. You're right down the road from me. I'm up in LZU, 72 miles. So that class, you're near class Delta. You're untowered. That's another thing. For your check ride, there's going to be a lot of going over sectional charts, what everything means, know what a high WAS is, how to find that kind of stuff. You know what these gray circles are, obviously. Probably living down there and flying near, what is this airport? Robins Air Force Base? Warner Robins? MGA. Where's MGA? Oh, what? Not an airport. Middle Georgia University. Oh, gotcha. What you should do is fly up here to Milledgeville, Baldwin County Regional. This is one of my favorite airports to fly to. From you, KMAC to MLJ, 25 miles. You might have been there already. Oh, you did. There you go. Yeah. What is this runway? 2827. The approach over the lake's really cool. That's where I did my first cross countries there. And when I finally start teaching, that's going to be where I take my students. Where's Thomaston? I want to say that I've been there too. That sounds familiar. I've been to Thompson McDuffie. That's not what you're talking about, right? What is the ICAO for Thomaston? Probably looking at it. I just can't see it right now. Up something. Thomaston, where's Thomaston at? Oh, here it is. I got you. What is that? DPN? OPN. 36 miles. Never been that. Usually I stay on this side because I don't want to. For us, I mean, I could fly under the shelves of the Bravo probably with no big deal, but it just, I usually get flight following, and we're kind of in that arrival corridor, particularly if they're landing to the west. So Milledgeville was always an easy one. It was easy to stay outside of the Bravo for that. KOPN, yeah, I got it. There it is. What other airports around here? Thompson McDuffie is nice, but there's nothing around there. It's not particularly notable, but the airport and the facilities are super nice. Washington Wilkes. I stopped for fuel there on the way back from like a long night cross country for commercial, and it's like an aircraft carrier because there's no city lights. I mean, I guess whatever Washington is, but there's basically no factor at night. I couldn't see that at all. So you can see the runway lights, and that's it. Once you take off, you're outside of the departure end of the runway. It's just black. Hell yeah, dude. I'm not doing so much cross country these days, but certainly going to be probably shortly. Hopefully, I'm going to be done with my CFI in, I don't know, by January, and got a job lined up at the airport here basically. So be back into it. Anyway, John, I live so I fly out of LZU, so I live around that area. I'm about 14 miles from the airport, which is good for us. Like we got the lake up here, and this is pretty much all these airports feed into it as like a training area. So there's a good open space up here where there's not complicated airspace, decent scenery. But never ever go to Winder. Winder is over. Where is that? Barrow, Winder. This airport is a shithole. The good thing about aviation is that it's really easy. I mean, look, Milledgeville, that would take about 2 hours for me to drive down there, but you can get there in about 40 minutes in an airplane, which is freaking sweet. Yeah, aviation definitely puts everything in perspective. I mean, even I fly for my check rides. I've been going to Greenville. There's a DP up there named Brett Zakowski. Super good guy. Highly recommend him. I don't know what you guys do for check rides down there. I'm sure you get probably somebody local, but 96 nautical miles. It would take me a few hours to get up there by car, and it seems really far away, but I mean, in an airplane, everything's relative. Anyway, I'm going to go get some lunch. John, good talking to you. If you want to see anything else, let me know. Leave a comment or something. I'm not sure what you are working on precisely. And obviously, for private pilot, a lot of this stuff. I mean, you passed your check ride or your instrument or your knowledge test. Jeez, struggling for words today. And most of that stuff is, your oral check ride. The oral part of your check ride is going to cover most of the stuff that you just took your test about. It's not particularly complicated. You don't have to go into too deep a detail for PPL. Sounds good, man, guys. Hey, thanks for hanging out. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment. I hope that makes sense. Density altitude is important. We'll talk to you later, guys. Have a good one. John, take it easy. Good flying. Safe flying. Cheers, guys. See ya.